for everyone too. Oh, whoops.
Exactly.
Whoops. I'm going to pause that. Okay, so we're back to recording. All right, so we do have a good crowd coming in tonight. I do expect a good crowd, Jane. So I'm just going to get started with a few program announcements real quick, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Because we do have some good programs coming up, and I want to make sure that this crowd gets all the information. So tomorrow night, Wednesday, April 27th at 7 p.m., just because it's tomorrow, and I want to make sure that anyone who's in Chelmsford knows that this is happening. We have a virtual event with the Chelmsford Water District on PFAS. And bear with me here. PFAS is the perfluorooctanoic acid. And it's going to be a discussion on the levels that they find. It's with the environmental compliance manager for the Chelmsford Water District. And to discuss these PFAS levels, what they're doing about it, where you can find it, how you can limit exposure. So Todd Melanson, who is with the Chelmsford Water District, will be online with us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. To discuss that. Something a little bit, and then we continue our One Book Chelmsford series of programs with the stories of the Vietnamese diaspora, of which our One Book Chelmsford author, Ocean Vuong, was a part. Ocean Vuong's family was a part, and that's going to be led by Tracy Nguyen Mang, who is the founder and host of the Vietnamese Boat People podcast. And she herself and her family, she has her own story to tell about fleeing Vietnam in the 1980s. So please join us for that. I'm super pumped about that program, and that's going to be on Thursday at 7 p.m. And she's wonderful, a wonderful storyteller. Then on Wednesday, May 4th at 7 p.m., the Traveling Librarian presents Laos. So we're going to go to Laos Luang Prabang. And so that's led by Jeff Clapes, the Traveling Librarian. Compelling questions on Friday, May 13th. Oh, sorry, the Traveling Librarian was on May 4th. Yep. On Friday, May 13th at 1 p.m., we have a new compelling questions. Does truth matter? Led by Dr. Joshua Tepley, who is an associate professor of philosophy at St. Anselm College. So that should be super interesting. Then on Thursday, May 19th, Sarah Lohman is going to come back and talk to us about the story of sriracha, everyone's favorite condiment, right? You either love it or hate it. And then, of course, continuing our One Book Chelmsford series of programs, we have Ocean Vuong's visit, virtual visit on May 26th, Thursday at 7 p.m. And he'll be in conversation with another prize-winning poet, Sandra Lim of UMass Lowell. So this would be a really, really interesting program. And then finally, on Tuesday, May 31st, we have Art on Tuesdays with Don't Judge a Library by Its Building. This is absolutely going to be my favorite. I've actually been to the library in Kansas City, where they have decorated their parking garage like a set of books, and it's just wonderful, very refreshing. And so we're going to look at library design. But tonight, Jane is going to talk to us about landscape as canvas and earth art. I, for one, am a big fan of one of the artists that she's going to talk. I don't know the other artists, so I don't know if I'm a fan, but I do know Andy Goldsworthy. So I'm really excited about that. I know that we have a number of people on this call, on this meeting, who have perhaps are part of our member libraries. So I'm going to go through an introduction for Jane. Chelmsford knows her pretty well by now. But Jane Oneail holds a master's in art history from the Boston University and a master's in education from the Harvard University Graduate School of Education. She's a New Hampshire native and has worked with some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Courier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. Jane founded the Courier's Alzheimer's Cafe and led the tour program for the museum and the Frank Lloyd Wright designed Zimmerman House. She has taught art history at the college level for more than a decade, most recently at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. Her nonprofit is Culturally Curious. Culturally Curious's mission is to engage, educate, and unify groups through facilitated arts experiences that inspire joy and foster critical and creative thinking, as well as an appreciation for our shared humanity. And I should say this presentation is funded through a partnership between the Chelmsford Library and the libraries of Andover, Billerica, and North Reading. Tonight, as I said, she's going to present landscape. This is landscape art, earth art, as part of the celebration of Earth Day and also Arbor Day. I also forgot to mention that the library is giving away seedlings in celebration of Arbor Day and Earth Day. So stop by the library to get those. But tonight's description: in the 1960s and 70s, like artists like Robert Smithson, Nancyholt, and Anna Mendieta began the revolutionary practice of making art using materials from the natural world. We'll learn more about the inspiration for the movement and get insight into the works of several leading artists, including Andy Goldsworthy. And so if you have any questions for Jane, please submit them to the chat or use the Q&A module, and I would be happy to ask them on your behalf. And this presentation will be recorded, so I will send that out to you tomorrow as soon as I can download it and upload it. So thank you so much, Jane, for joining us again tonight.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you everybody who is with us tonight for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about earth art, or to just enjoy the gorgeous imagery that we are going to be sharing over the next hour together. So, so just to give us this little primer, just to get us all on the same page, earth art, which is also known as land art, was a movement that originated in the late 1960s, the early 1970s. It's primarily American and British artists. And really what makes this period so interesting, I think, is that they're using, well, novel materials. They're using the natural land. They're using novel practices, and they are creating work really outside of the systems of museums and galleries for the most part. So it's a really innovative movement. There's a lot more to it than that, of course, and we'll be digging into all of it, but that's a good sort of overview introduction. We will, of course, be getting back to this particular site that's on the screen with this gorgeous image here. This is the Spiral Jetty, probably the best known example of earth art, and we'll spend a lot of time with it tonight. But let me give you a sense in terms of how we'll move through the material tonight. We're going to start off with sort of the background, the roots of the movement, and that is like the earth art that existed before the term earth art existed. And then we'll turn our attention to the 1960s and the 1970s, and really what sort of primed the pump, what set the stage for this movement? What was it reacting against? What was it reacting in accord with? And then we'll spend the rest of the hour on these four specific artists: Smithson, Holt, Mendieta, and Goldsworthy. Now, this will in no way be a comprehensive overview of earth art, but I think between the four of these artists, we get a really good sense of the different kinds of practices that exist within this category of art. And I think it will probably whet your appetite for more. I've given this program a few times this month, and a lot of the feedback is like, we want earth art part 2. And then of course, we'll just do a quick wrap up. I love the image that I have on the screen here. This is an example of Andy Goldsworthy art. And this is a eucalyptus grove in San Francisco. And I think it's a great image to have with our introduction, because we're going to sort of meander through this material tonight in the same way that he has sort of formed these logs to sort of meander through this pathway. All right, so let's get started with our prehistory, everything that came before Earth art that set the stage for it. And we are going way back in time. We are going back to prehistory. We're going to start off with probably the best known example of Earth art, and that is, of course, Stonehenge. It's in Wiltshire, England. It dates to about 3000 BC, and it's this really mysterious formation. We know that it was made by man, of course, but we can see just how large these stones are. We've got a few human beings over here to give us a sense of scale. And we know that this was created before the advent of the wheel. So this was a major undertaking that involved dozens, if not hundreds of people. We know that stone was quarried from miles and miles away in order to create this exact formation. We also know that over time it's been it's degraded, and that's in part due to natural conditions. That's due in part to man, of course, and how he's influenced the site. But we also know that, well, I should say, we have these sort of interesting metaphysical associations with this site. There's a lot about it that we know, and a lot about it that still remains sort of mysterious. We oftentimes think of it as a calendar. It has these alignments with the equinox and the sun rising and setting. So perhaps it has sort of a larger purpose related to, early agrarian societies. There's, like I said, a lot we don't know, but there's something that seems really majestic, something that seems really powerful, really mysterious about the movement of these very large stones, particularly the placement of these lintel stones, these horizontal capstones that would have formed a perfect ring around the originally built Stonehenge here too. Just imagine lifting these very heavy, like these stones that weigh tons up nearly 18 feet into the air to make this perfect ring here. So the purpose behind it, I think, is also part of the mystery, part of the lingering mystery. So we continue on through time to the Great Pyramids of Giza in Egypt. And oftentimes the pyramids in Giza are swept under the umbrella of architecture, and we wouldn't necessarily consider them examples of earth art, but that is, of course, exactly what they are. These are examples of architecture that were made out of cut stone in the same way that Stonehenge was made out of cut stone. It involved a massive undertaking of hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals to put these stones exactly into place. And sort of like Stonehenge, there's theories out there, I think largely debunked, but theories out there that the placement of these particular pyramids align with the constellation Orion and the formation of Orion's belt. So we always imagine that there's this kind of greater purpose, maybe like a celestial connection between these massive earthworks and their connection to religion, to architecture, to all these sort of bigger ideas here. Now, just to give us a sense and an appreciation for the scale of the Great Pyramids of Giza, I have this great shot here with a woman down at the bottom, sort of looking up the side of one of these pyramids, probably the largest pyramid in this case. And we can see just how large these stones are and just how precisely they were cut. This is, I mean, one of the reasons, the very reason why these pyramids exist today. They were placed in such a precise manner, cut in such a precise manner. And so the drive to do this, I think, remains that kind of mysterious element. The way they were created remains that sort of siren song for so many people. They want to know more about an earthwork like this. Now we're going to jump from Africa over to South America and look at the Nazca lines in Peru. Now, these lines were created anywhere between 500 BC and 500 AD. And I'm sure at some point you've seen some imagery related to these lines. Most of them are just straight lines in the desert, but there are these very large images too, oftentimes referred to as effigies. There's somewhere around 80 of them in the desert of Peru, and they're anywhere from 400 yards to over 1,000 yards in terms of the area that they're dominating. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, how were these lines made? Very simply, in fact, they are just, for the most part, these very simple channels that were created by just moving dirt and moving pebbles and creating about a foot of distance between them, and about, they're about 6 inches deep. And these lines have remained there because there's virtually no human intervention and there's no wind in this desert. This is like the perfect place to make something like this. But their purpose remains very mysterious. And of course, we again imagine this, this greater connection with the heavens, right? I mean, it seems like there's an audience in the sky that these images were created for. So we've got a monkey here, we've got insects like this fantastic spider, and also plants and birds. We've got the great flower over here and a hummingbird on the right. And I think the image from the Nazca lines in Peru that I think fascinates so many people is, of course, the human figure that seems to be waving into the sky. So all these continuing mysteries, these lingering questions about the how and the why these works were created. So we will end with a look at North America, because there are some very early earthworks in America as well. They're referred to as mounds, and the largest one is in Illinois. We can see it over here on the left. It's roughly 100 feet high. We get a sense of the scale here with the figure at the bottom and a few figures at the top. Now, this is an earthwork. This is soil that was excavated by hand someplace else and moved to the specific site and put into this formation to create something that is sort of like a man-made mountain, essentially. There's a lot of different theories in terms of why, but we do know that this was a hierarchical society at this point. This is somewhere around 1000 AD. And so we imagine that this is probably a temple or related to, some system of power or some way to honor the dead. Over here on the right, we have another mound in North America. This one is in southern Ohio, and you can see it is like this snake-like formation that stretches on for 1,300 feet over here. This is the largest serpent effigy on the planet. And it was created, I think, even earlier than the mound over here on the left. I think it's about 1,300 years old. So the fact that it was created, first of all, the fact that it has endured, there's all these lingering mysteries. We don't necessarily know the how or the why, but we do know that, that earlier cultures felt it was imperative to create these works using the landscape itself. And there's continued fascination around that. So we'll wrap up our seeds and roots section, going full circle here back to Stonehenge, which we can see at the top, and then just across the highway, a modern nod to it with the crop circle here in this great spiral formation. Even crop circles can be considered landscape art, even though we don't often know who made them. All right, so I will just say I never expected to include a crop circle in any of my programs. So let's turn our attention now to the 1960s and the 1970s and look at exactly what was happening in the world that set the stage for artists to be thinking about using the landscape again as material for works of art. All right, so that would be our climate and conditions. So the first thing that so many of these artists are reacting against is pop art, the kind of work that artists like Andy Warhol were producing. Here's an Andy Warhol print of Coca-Cola bottles on the left. And then on the right, we have a soft sculpture by Klaus Oldenburg from 1963. what else but French fries and ketchup. It reminds you of, visiting McDonald's, right? This is all about consumer culture, this idea of creating waste really too, but also celebrating capitalism, this idea of celebrating advertising, celebrating the mundane, but the things that have been mass produced and man-made. This becomes disdained essentially by these earth artists. And these are things that they're going to turn their attention away from. Now, there is another movement in the art world that is very influential to our earth artists, and I'm going to introduce you to it very briefly. This is the movement called minimalism, which I think is hard for many people still to this day to really appreciate. And I will say, sometimes even for me as well. What we're looking at here is probably the most famous example of minimalist sculpture. The artist here is an American artist named Carl Andre. This is called Equivalent 8. And it's from 1966. He did a number of versions of this same sculpture that he called equivalent because he would use the same number of bricks in different configurations. Now, what makes this a minimalist sculpture? Well, we can see that he's done a minimal amount of work to create a work of art. He's basically selected material and he's selected the way it would be arranged. But other than that, Carl Andre didn't really do anything to make a work of art here. Yet a work like this asks us, the viewers, to notice the material, notice its relationship to us in the space, notice how it changes the spaces that we occupy. It also asks us to think about how we associate a shape like this even in our own lives. So there's a lot of different things that minimalism does, but it certainly inspired a lot of the earth artists that we're going to see today. Incidentally, this work was involved in a big scandal with the Tate Museum in London because they acquired it for the equivalent of about $6,000. That's right, they paid $6,000 for a pile of bricks. So that was the scandal. I mean, it was taxpayer money, and most people don't really want their money spent in that way. So it's been called the most boring controversy in the history of art. All right, so let's turn our attention to a few other things that were happening in the world. And that was this rising concern and rising awareness about the state of the environment, the state of the globe, really. And when you look at environmental history, a lot of historians point to the publication of this book, Silent Spring, from 1962, as being particularly influential about about all kinds of pollution, but in particular, the use of synthetic pesticides. And even though it's early 1960s, it sort of began this groundswell that kind of culminates towards the end of the decade. By 1968, we have this incredible photograph from the astronaut Bill Anders, and he was on the Apollo 8 mission. And so we see this, I'm stunned every time I look at this photograph, the moon in the foreground and just half of our little blue planet here in the distance. And a photograph like this really changed the way a lot of the people think of the planet. It's like they understood for the first time or in a new way just how small we are in the universe and also just how limited our resources are. This notion like we only have one planet, we have to take care of it, really began to resonate because of an image like this one. So by 1970, we have the beginning of Earth Day. Over on the left, we've got Pat and Richard Nixon planting a tree on the White House lawn in celebration of the first Earth Day, and a demonstration in Union Square, New York City, with people, coming to this realization and rallying for the protection of our natural resources, and in particular, this notion that we have dwindling energy resources as well. So that leads us all to the culmination, really, the 1971 commercial from Keep America Beautiful, that was all about pollution, right? And you have this Native American figure who's walking through the landscape and then who consequentially turns to the camera, sheds a single tear, suggesting really just how really ashamed we should be for the way we've been treating the planet, suggesting everything needs to change. Now, this is the climate for what happens in the art world. And that is artists begin to use natural materials. Like we've been building up to this, right? But I would say the very beginnings are almost comical. And I think that they're maybe difficult for most people to really appreciate. But this is an installation by one of the artists that we'll be looking at tonight, Robert Smithson. And what we are looking at, of course, here is just piles of dirt in a gallery set up against some mirrors. This is dirt. This is the stuff we wipe off of our shoes when we come home, but it's also the stuff we grow our food in. It's inconsequential and at the same time, so incredibly important. And Robert Smithson and these other artists are going to be asking us to look at dirt and to consider dirt in new ways. So that leads us all up to our introduction to Robert Smithson, who is probably the most important artist associated with this movement. Here he is in two different pictures here. Robert Smithson was born in 1938 and he grew up in New Jersey. He went to art school and then he just sort of settled right in New York City and somehow sort of immediately began rubbing elbows with these really influential minimalist artists like Carl Andre and many others. He got gallery representation pretty quickly, and the gallery that was working with him was also able to facilitate introductions to artists like Donald Judd and Robert Morris and Nancyholt, an artist that we'll be looking at tonight, and also an artist that Robert Smithson ends up marrying. So these relationships have a really big role to play. Now, here's some other looks at Robert Smithson here. We see him with a gallery installation behind him over on the right, and I absolutely love this picture on the left, where he is simply loading rocks into the back of this station wagon. And somehow I always imagined the person who snapped this photograph of him was either thinking, this guy's a genius or this guy is totally nuts, and we'll see where this goes. But Robert Smithson did indeed collect rocks and exhibit them in New York City galleries, sometimes in interesting arrangements like we see over here, and oftentimes with maps or aerial photographs accompanying them, sort of rooting them to the places where these rocks came from. He called these installations non-sites. And so he was very mindful of the fact that these rocks came from someplace else, and now they're being displayed in sort of like a false setting. He wrote prolifically about his thinking related to earth art, and he was very theoretical in his writing. He was like the philosopher associated with the earth art movement. In 1968, he wrote A Provisional Theory of Non-Sites. And just to give you a little insight into how his mind works, he wrote, this little theory is tentative and could be abandoned at any time. Theories, like things, are also abandoned. That theories are eternal is doubtful. Vanished theories compose the strata of many forgotten books. So I love that he's kind of thinking about information and ideas as like the sediment of the land in some ways, but also as these things that could be discarded, like pollution in and of itself. So there's a lot going on with Robert Smithson, but it's said that he was inspired by hanging around in New Jersey and seeing an excavator just kind of tearing up the earth and these boulders and seeing this earth moving and seeing these boulders being excavated reminded him of like classical sculpture, classical antiquity. And so he began to sort of imbue working with dirt and soil as having this kind of monumental connection to history, which is why we went through our roots and seeds today. So this brings us to one more important idea for Robert Smithson, and that is entropy. So we're going to delve into entropy by way of this dead tree, which he put into a gallery in 1969. This is a restaging of his original dead tree from just a few years ago. All right, so entropy. This is an idea that fascinated and directed Robert Smithson's movements, according to earth art. So entropy is, of course, the second law of thermodynamics here, and it predicts the inevitable depletion and collapse of every system. So for Robert Smithson, it's this idea that you can create order, you can create structure, but it will sort of slowly move to disorder and then eventually move to chaos. And he likes this idea, and he sees it happening in the natural world. And he sees his artwork involved in entropy as being expressions or demonstrations of entropy as well. So all of this is kind of linked to a sort of cynical idea of what's happening in civilization post World War II, right? Before this, we kind of thought that we were on this steady march forward towards progress. And Robert Smithson is basically saying, no, we are in the process of kind of coming apart here. So, it's a little dark in some ways. So let's talk about this dead tree for a moment. He did just bring a dead tree into a gallery. He actually put some two-sided mirrors around it as well. So you, the viewer, are supposed to move through this gallery and appreciate how this tree is dying, how entropy is at play here. So every kind of shriveled leaf, all this desiccated evidence of the root structure down here. This is what we're supposed to really ruminate on when we're looking at his dead tree. So Robert Smithson goes outside and he begins to contemplate these bigger structures. Some of them are man-made, like this Neolithic tomb in the UK, and some of them are naturally made, like the balanced rock over here at the Arches National Park. And you can imagine, for somebody interested in entropy, it's like he's looking at these formations, at these creations, and just thinking about how the world is eventually going to undo them. And all of this leads to his greatest, best known work, which is called Spiral Jetty from 1970. This is the work that defines landscape art. And I should mention that Robert Smithson is the person that coined the term land art or earth art. And he called this, as opposed to being a non-site, he called this an earth work. That's, defining my materials are the earth here. So the Spiral Jetty is this monumental counterclockwise coil that stretches out into the Great Salt Lake in Utah. It's a massive sculpture that was in part financed by a $9,000 grant from his gallerist in New York City. What an undertaking, right? Like go make a spiral jetty out in Utah. So it's a really interesting idea. It's something that is sort of in harmony with the natural landscape, but it's also a really unnatural extension of this shoreline as well. And for Robert Smithson, the shoreline had already been disrupted by industry and urbanization. So what he was doing was actually more in keeping with the natural world. So how do you make something like this? Well, there's a video if you're really interested. There's a half-hour video about the construction of the Spiral Jetty. And it was very modern in its undertaking. You can see that there was heavy equipment that was used in order to make it. In fact, he had a hard time finding a contractor because, they were all like, what are you, crazy? And so he eventually found someone who later said, the most important thing I've ever done as a contractor serves absolutely no purpose. In the end, they moved over 6,000 tons of earth to create a 1,600 foot long jetty that is about 15 feet wide all the way around. That gives you a sense of scale there. Now, for many of the pictures, you'll notice that the Great Salt Lake sort of has a funky tinge to it. And that is, of course, because this is a terminal basin. This is a lake that has no outlets. It doesn't flow anywhere. Water just flows in. So that means there's this constant process of evaporation. The water goes up into the air, and what's left are the minerals, the salt. So it's very dense with salt, hence the name, Great Salt Lake. And that also means that almost nothing can live in it. The only things that can live in it are these microorganisms that sometimes turn the water pink, which is really interesting. It's sort of like the Dead Sea. And for Robert Smithson, he loved the color. He talked about it as being as sort of evoking the primordial seas. He talked about looking at the Great Salt Lake, and it was bleeding scarlet streaks. This is right up his alley. So it's worth mentioning that the spiral form that he decides on is a form that we've already seen a few times through hundreds of years of history. This is a form that that early man has been motivated to make in large forms here too. It's a form that is embedded in our lives because it is a natural form. It's in our fingertips, it's in plants and shells, of course, and then even in the shape of our galaxy. Now I'm going to wax a little bit poetic here, so forgive me, but we're spending a little extra time with the spiral jetty. It also has really fascinating connections to numbers too. A spiral is associated with the Fibonacci sequence of numbers, which is you take two numbers, you start off with 1 and 1, that adds up to 2, and then you do 1 and 2, that adds up to 3. 2 and 3 adds up to 5. And so as this is plotted out in 2 dimensions, you can see that this creates the shape of a spiral here. This spiral form is also associated with the golden ratio or the golden mean. It's not exactly the same thing as the Fibonacci sequence, but it's something that has been really influential in the art world for hundreds of years, even way before Leonardo da Vinci and the Mona Lisa. But this is a great example to demonstrate the golden ratio. The golden ratio starts with a rectangle that, like you see here, that is then subdivided into a square and another rectangle. Now, what makes this the golden ratio, or what the Renaissance artists refer to as a divine ratio, is that the second rectangle, the subdivided rectangle, has the same aspect ratio of the original rectangle. So you can see the way the Mona Lisa has been subdivided here in all these different ways, is that it is like it can be dissected again and again and again using the golden ratio. The entire picture itself is the golden ratio. You can, create a square going this way or a square going this way, but you can also create a square or a rectangle, I should say, right on the Mona Lisa's face. And then if you keep doing it again and again and again, you get that spiral once again. So there's a lot of really interesting associations for the spiral. The spiral isn't just a random form that he pulled out of nowhere. It creates, an air of mystery and purpose, something greater than when we're thinking about this particular sculpture. So what do we do with it? Are you just supposed to take a picture and know that it's there? For a lot of earth artists, yeah, that's the case. And for Robert Smithson, I mean, he wanted this to be sort of taken away by the waters, but there's a lot of people that still kind of make the pilgrimage to go out there. And what do you do when you get there? Do you just stand on the shoreline and appreciate the form of a sculpture? Or do you methodically, walk it, going around in these, ever smaller circles till you get to the end, and then you just turn around and walk back? Well, as I was thinking about, what would I do if I actually went out to the spiral jetty, which apparently is like 2 hours away from the closest airport? What would I do? I think I would have to walk it. And it sort of reminded me of the form of a labyrinth, which dates, way back to classical antiquity, but they're well known as being part of the architecture of Gothic churches, part of the function of a pilgrim, somebody who's gone on a great journey, to a great spiritual journey, and they've arrived, but they continue to move through this meander. It's not even a maze. It's just a path that takes them, well, it asks them to continue moving. And it's an experience for mind, body, and soul. In fact, Harvard medical researchers have determined that as you're walking a labyrinth like this, your heart rate lowers, your blood pressure lowers, your chronic pain is diminished. And I almost think well, I wonder, was Robert Smithson sort of thinking the same thing, that people could be sort of transformed and changed if they walked along this spiral jetty? I don't know. What I do know is his main focus was that he would build this thing, and that slowly the waters would sort of take it away. Now, what's really interesting is shortly after it was built, it was submerged in the waters of the Great Salt Lake. You could barely see it. And that remained true for almost 2 decades. And I think for the most part, people kind of forgot about it. It seemed almost like a failed experiment for some people. But now you can see in a more recent photograph that the waters have receded. And I think this is in part to climate change too. The spiral jetty isn't even in the water anymore. So it will still be diminished over the years by the natural environment, by the weather, by the climate, but probably not in the way that Robert Smithson originally envisioned. So we'll finish up with Robert Smithson with just a quick peek at his very last work. And this is called Amarillo Ramp from 1973. The concept here was to create another path sort of similar to the spiral jetty, but in this case, it's just this C-shaped that starts off very low, and it eventually, like a ramp, as it goes around this curve, it gets higher and higher and higher. And the concept was that this ramp would be built in a lake, in the basin of a lake. Now, Robert Smithson was up in a plane surveying this landscape, and tragically, the plane crashed. He was just 35 years old when he died. I mean, think of how much more he could have produced in his lifetime. His wife, Nancyholt, who we'll be meeting shortly, and a few other artists continued this work. They completed this work. And then Nancyholt, as we'll see, sort of endeavors to preserve his memory and his legacy. So this seems like a good transition to looking at the work of Nancy Holt, who is in every way as fascinating as Robert Smithson. All right, so Nancy Holt is kind of a local girl. She grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, but then attended high school in New Jersey, which is where she met Robert Smithson. They were actually friends in high school, and then she went to Tufts for an undergraduate degree in biology. And after she graduated, she moved to New York City, where she reconnected with Robert Smithson. And just a few years after she graduated in 1960, she and Smithson were married. She began her career in the arts behind the camera. She was really interested in taking photographs, in making movies, and in recording audio. This is a great photograph of her. She was actually the artist that recorded the making of the spiral jetty. And I think it's really important for us to remember that she got her start behind the camera. She is somebody who is accustomed to framing something and to maybe thinking about the experience of something from start to finish as well. So this leads us to one of her early works, which is called Sun Tunnels. This is in the Great Basin Desert in Utah, and she began this the same year that her husband died in 1973, finished it 3 years later. This is a work that involves concrete, steel, and earth, and this is also a work that is completely concerned with framing our view, but not like a picture frame in a museum. It's like the lens of a camera, really. It goes back to that early experience that she had in the art world behind a camera, behind any sort of recording equipment. This is another really fascinating work that seems to bring the heavens down to earth. And in some ways, sort of like Stonehenge, it functions as a celestial calendar. So I want to show you a couple of, well, over here on the right, we've got an installation image. This is Nancyholt instructing how these tunnels would be installed in the desert. And I should mention, she raised funds to purchase this land specifically for this installation. Now, each of these tunnels weighs 22 tons, and it rests on a buried concrete foundation. So it's not just like she rolled some pre-made tunnels out into the middle of nowhere. Each of these tunnels is over 9 feet in diameter. We get a sense of scale here with Nancyholt standing in one of them. So it's a massive undertaking. So what is the purpose here? Well, we see from the aerial view, it's like in this loose X configuration. And like I said, the purpose here is to kind of function like Stonehenge. There's an alignment of the view here through 2 tunnels on the equinox. So you can see the sun rising at a certain point. And actually, the way this was created, there's this beautiful alignment 10 days before the equinox, and I think about 10 days afterwards too. And in addition to just that sunrise and the sunset, she has also bored these holes through the tunnels themselves. Those holes and their arrangement and their sizes relate to specific constellations in the sky. But you can see throughout the day, they create these beautiful circles of light in the tunnels themselves. And those circles are ever moving, right? Apparently, if you're sitting in the tunnel, it's 15 to 20 degrees cooler inside. Which, when I read that, I immediately just thought, well, how cool would it be to just kind of dwell in one of these spaces for an entire day, maybe even a night, and watch the moonlight come through those little holes as well, and to just appreciate the movement of this light. She's asking us to appreciate like the simplest thing that happens on this planet in a whole new way. So I think with what Nancyholt has done with this installation, she's added this kind of very simple but elegant poetry to this desert landscape, and has made us appreciate this relationship between art and astronomy and construction in a whole new way. Now, what's important to understand with Nancyholt is that she intended these constructions, her earthworks, to be used and to be appreciated. We are looking at another work by Holt. This is called Stone Enclosure Rock Rings from 1978. This is made of brown mountain stone, and we can see that it's 2 concentric rings that have been constructed. This is on the campus of Western Washington University. And so this is something that was made to be experienced, that was put in a place where other people would be around. And it's another work that has this fascinating connection to astronomy. She worked with masons and astronomers to ensure that there was this alignment with the North Star on specific dates. When we get down to earth here too, we can appreciate the construction, but also this kind of beautiful space that's created with just those 2 concentric circles. We get the sense of another tunnel, right? Or the sense that she is framing up our view in a very conscious way. Now, Nancyholt was a forerunner of the public sculpture and public park integration, this whole movement that was happening in the 1970s and the 1980s. And that leads us to Dark Star Park, which is a really great name, which I can't help feel like was probably influenced by Star Wars in some ways. This is a whole integrated sculpture park setting that completely renews and this kind of unattended to area in Alexandria, Virginia. This is the before over here, and this is the after. We see these manicured lawns, but what's really important when it comes to Nancyholt are these giant concrete spheres. And I'm going to take you sort of further down this path, and we'll look backwards, So here is those same spheres, and we can see that there's a round tunnel that they correlate to, as well as these circular pools of water. So it's a completely integrated space. One of these concrete spheres also has a hole bored through it too. So it's about aligning our view for something, for a very specific glimpse. There, I believe there's another hole bored through one of the other spheres that we'll be seeing, because from the aerial view over here, the installation continues across the street. And we can see Nancyholt here in the photograph on the right. She is standing basically over on this side of the road, and we can see that there's a few spheres behind her, as well as these tall poles. Now, this is all part of her installation. You can see from the aerial view that sort of surrounding those spheres is this black pigmentation on the pavement. We see it over here as well. And that is an artificial shadow. And the shadows of the spheres and the poles lines up once a year on a specific date at a specific time, marking actually the purchase of this land, dating back to 1860. Now, who really cares about the purchase of the land? No one, right? But look at the community that turns out to see the alignment of these shadows. I mean, it's a community celebration. This is all about this notion of how to like increase positive usage of public park space, right? There is something almost supernatural, otherworldly, when we see these astronomical elements kind of coming into play here. There's something metaphysical about it that I think people really appreciate and enjoy. So Nancyholt goes on to have a very distinguished career. Now, I mentioned before, her husband dies when they are both 35 years old, and she lives for another 40 years. And during that time, she's creating work, she's winning all these awards, not enough in my opinion, and she's also working to preserve his legacy. So she died at the age of 75 in 2014. And very interestingly, her will created the Holt Smithson Foundation. They have an incredible website. I highly recommend you going to explore their website. All sorts of great pictures and really good information about their projects. But according to their will, the foundation ends in 2038. So on the 100th anniversary of the birth of both of these artists. So we only have a short time to appreciate the wonderful things that they've done, at least on website form. So now let's turn our attention to another earth artist who wasn't quite in the same circle as Smithson and Holt. And this artist is Ana Mendieta. Now, Ana Mendieta was a full 10 years younger than Smithson and Holt. She wasn't a part of the New York City circles that they were in, at least not initially. She was actually still in college in the Midwest when Smithson was making the spiral jetty in 1970, but she, like him, will die a very premature and tragic death. So let's start off with her early life. Ana Mendieta was born in Cuba. We can see her here in the center foreground. These are her siblings and her parents. She was from an upper middle class family. She enjoyed a very comfortable background, but she and her sister were sent to America in 1961 as part of Operation Peter Pan. It was a way to get essentially political refugees out of Cuba. So she and her sister were sent to Iowa by themselves. She was just on the cusp of puberty, kind of ripped away from her family. And she was, living in foster homes and orphanages. She was attending reform school because of the status of being a refugee, essentially. So it was a particularly difficult thing for her to bear. And we'll see that it certainly makes its mark on the kinds of works that she produces as well. She was, I should mention, ultimately reunited with her family years later. So she ends up staying in Iowa for college, and she earns a BA and an MA in painting and an MFA too for her work in intermedia, which included sculpture, painting, and video art. Now, one thing of consequence that happens while she's studying at the University of Iowa is that a fellow student was violently raped on campus. And Anna Mendieta begins to create a series of work, really, actually, I mean, throughout her life that sort of respond to violence against women. So Chicken Blood features largely into her body of work. So if blood makes you a little queasy, you have been warned. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of her student work because she has such a short lifespan, but it gives us some insight into who she was and how she operated. This is a work from 1972. Like I said, she's still a student here. This is untitled, but what she's doing is she's collaborating with a fellow student who is cutting his hair, trimming his beard and a little bit of his head hair, and she is affixing it to her face. And so with this work, she is certainly playing with notions of gender. I mean, she's doing work in 1972 that I feel like only some people are just like dipping their toes into now in 2022. This is really subversive. It really distorts notions of beauty. I mean, she is a strikingly beautiful woman, and here she is kind of making herself look masculine, look male here. So she's calling in to question, all of our constructs around gender here too. But for our purposes, for earth art here, she is also kind of playing with this notion of, okay, well, hair is growing and hair is organic, but it's also dead and it can also be severed and reconfigured. So this sort of speaks to things that will be coming along the way. Another earth work that she did as when she was still a student, this is from the same year. This is also, this is not untitled. This is called Blood and Feathers 2. This was shot on a Super 8 camera where she is standing in front of this creek on this sandy shore here, and she dumps chicken blood all over her front and back and then rolls around on the ground where she has put all these feathers, and then she stands up, and in the last few frames of the film she kind of extends her arms like we see here, almost like a bird. So we see in a work like this, all of these connections to bigger ideas. There's death, there's sacrifice, there's transformation, all of these things coming into play here. And of course, major religious overtones, but I bring in a work like this, of course, because she's working with organic materials here. This leads us to her Silhouette series, which occupies her from 1972 for the next 5 years or so. And I think it's worth comparing it to Smithson's Spiral Jetty because Smithson was creating something on a monumental scale. He called it an earthwork. And Anna Mendieta is dealing with things on a personal scale, and she called these works her body work. In this picture over here, she's lying in a grave in Mexico. She's lying in a tomb, and she has placed all of these flowers all over her body. So sort of like that hair that had been cut off before, there's this notion of death and things still growing, this sense of fecundity here, which is, it seems contradictory in so many ways. So her work is not meant to last. They are temporary sort of installations or sculptures that are captured with a photograph, and they're not meant to sort of be maintained or withstand the test of time in any ways. So we can see there's a number of different works over the course of the Silhouette series. Most often, she is going to a geographical place of significance to her, whether it's Iowa or Cuba or Mexico, and she lays down on the ground. Somebody traces her form here, and sometimes she sets it on fire. Sometimes she digs a hole. Sometimes she throws red paint to look like blood. Sometimes she actually uses chicken blood. So there's a variety of different ways that she connects her body to the land. And I think that's the big idea here. In an artist statement, she said, "I've been carrying out a dialogue between the landscape and the female body based on my own silhouette. I believe this has been a direct result of my having been torn from my homeland, Cuba, during my adolescence. I am overwhelmed by the feeling of having been cast from the womb or nature. My art is the way I reestablish the bonds that unite me to the universe. It is a return to the maternal source. So this is really personal. It's really vulnerable. It's really raw. These are just a few more examples of this Silhouetta series where we see her literally becoming rooted with the landscape. This is, in some ways really simple, in some ways really powerful too. And this is in fact her body lying face down in a pool of chicken blood, going back to this notion that she is always really, really sort of motivated to create art in response to her understanding of violence against women. And that leads us to her marriage. Once Ana Mendieta moves to New York City following her graduation from her MFA program, it's 1977. She is instantly involved with movers and shakers in New York City, and she meets the minimalist artist Carl Andre of the boring art controversy fame that we talked about before. Now, he is 13 years older than her, and he is a well-established minimalist artist who's already had his solo exhibition at the Guggenheim Museum. And so she is meeting someone who is, in some ways in a different league in terms of where his career is. The two artists date for many years. They have a very tumultuous relationship. They drink a lot, they fight a lot, but they get married in 1985. And sadly, just 8 months later, Ana Mendieta falls to her death from the 34th floor of their apartment building. And the circumstances surrounding her death, to say the least, are very suspicious. Carl Andre calls 911 and says, my wife is an artist and I'm an artist. And we had a quarrel about the fact that I was more exposed to the public than she was. And she went to the bedroom and I went after her and she went out the window. Now, there are witnesses that said that they heard them fighting. Carl Andre had scratches on his nose when the police came to question him. He was tried for her murder and acquitted due to lack of evidence. So her death is something that I think has been reassessed in recent years, and people have a renewed appreciation, a new understanding in terms of the dynamic in that relationship and all of the possibility of what Ana Mendieta could have contributed to the art world. Certainly as a young woman, she was full of potential. So when Carl Andre, who is 86 years old now, who is still alive and kicking and whose work is being exhibited all over the world, when his exhibitions are open, women show up and they protest and they ask, where's Ana Mendieta? And I think Ana Mendieta would be very proud to know that sometimes they even pour chicken blood on the sidewalk in front of institutions that are exhibiting Carl Andre's work. Even the Guerrilla Girls, the anonymous collective of artists and art historians that call themselves the conscience of the art world, have connected our Carl Andre to O.J. Simpson. So really his star is in decline, and Ana Mendieta's career and her contributions are being newly appreciated. So we will end tonight. Oh my God, I've gone so long and I apologize, with Andy Goldsworthy. And he is our only British artist for tonight. He lives in Scotland. He is roughly the same age as Ana Mendieta was. So he's about 65 years old today. And interestingly, he was also married to a sculptor. So he grew up on a farm and he got very used to doing these kind of rhythmic chores on a farm, whether it was like digging up a potato or something like that. And so he really associates that kind of rhythm with the kinds of works that he creates today. He also went to college to study art, and he had a very small studio space. And one day he just felt like he needed to get outside, and he went to the beach and he kind of worked with rocks and sand for a few hours. And he felt like in that time he had learned more about the natural world. He'd learned bigger lessons than he had throughout his entire art career, and he decided he wanted to stay outside. He told his professor about it, and his professor said, you should look at the work of Robert Smithson, who was at this time, and still is 10 years older than Andy Goldsworthy. So Andy Goldsworthy was inspired by Robert Smithson, but their work is so different. Of course, Goldsworthy's work was monumental in scale and was meant to sort of degrade over time. Andy Goldsworthy's experiments in nature are on a very intimate scale, and they are these unique constructions that almost immediately come apart. But here we've got the great sort of spiral comparison. So we've got these smooth beach stones that Andy Goldsworthy has found. He's cracked every single one of them in half. Just imagine how tough that is. He's added these scratches to the surface of them, and then he's created the spiral. Generally speaking, the forms that he makes, he says, are inspired by the context of the objects that he is using. And so he wouldn't just impose a spiral in a random space like this. Here's our context shot for this. It sort of seems like a spiral might make sense here. Now, Andy Goldsworthy preserves these works in photographs and then just kind of lets them be impacted by the landscape, lets them kind of come apart. And the best example of that is the student work that he created, where from the chaos of the stones on the beach, he creates nearly a straight line out to the water that is almost immediately taken apart because, the stones sink into the sand, or people walk by and sort of kick one of them. It's a moment in time that he captures with the photograph. These are works that you're not supposed to make a pilgrimage out to see because they almost immediately disappear. By the late 1970s, Andy Goldsworthy was really interested in stacking rocks. He is considered the father of the modern rock stacking movement. He started off with these big stones, these monumental installations. Occasionally he photographs them as they're kind of falling, but really the photographs are like the perfect moments that he is able to create. Over the next few years, his rock stacking gets smaller, but probably much more complicated. He's got these great little diary entries that kind of, in very quick little bursts, describe his feelings around this, and it's like, oh, and it held and it was magical kind of thing. In addition to rocks, he also works with sticks. And with a work like this that he created in Colorado, I think about right around 2006, he said finding the sticks was the hardest part and the most time-consuming part of this installation. But the final work itself has these associations with the natural environment. Of course, it's like throwing a rock into a river and seeing the ripples of water, but in this case, they're sticks. It also really looks like a great Saturn to me as well. And of course, after he takes the photograph, the sticks just kind of float away and the work is forever gone. Here's another work that he created in sticks early on. These are sycamore sticks in a line from 1983. He was working in the rain. He wrote in his diary he was beginning to get really irritated by the whole thing, but we've got this wonderful kind of serpentine line, reminds me of the serpentine effigy that we saw before, responding to these natural forms with natural materials. And in the past few decades, these constructions that he makes have gotten much more elaborate and so incredibly beautiful. This is a little bridge that does not span the stream, but instead emerges and then resubmerges in it. Over here is this kind of pointed arch pathway through the woods. You can only imagine how many times he tried to build this and it collapsed. There are great videos of him that document his process, and a lot of them are available on YouTube as well, where you can see him just struggling to create something and then it collapses, and it's all part of the process for him. But capturing the photograph of the finished work is, of course, so important. He sometimes gets involved in the work too. It's almost like a performance piece, but it's really just to capture the photograph. This is called Hedge Crawl. This is him, and he looks like a stick man in so many ways. It's just fantastic. He also does this thing called rain shadows, where when it begins to rain, and I can imagine in the UK, this is all the time, he'll just lie down on the ground. He gets really familiar, he said, with the different kinds of raindrops that are out there. And then when the rain passes, he stands up, and we've got his his silhouette on the ground, very similar to our Anna Mandiana, who we saw before. Interesting too, I'm just going to say there's a big difference here between the feminine silhouette and the kind of man spreading silhouette of Andy Goldsworthy. He even does the rain shadows more recently in city settings. This is him in New York City. People were like jumping over him, running to work as he's just lying on the sidewalk here. But he is very interested in what's happening on the ground. He does all these very interesting constructions and assemblages with just the leaves he finds in natural settings. And somehow the way he arranges them makes them seem almost like they've been painted. They're so spectacular. He loves this kind of circular nest form and a good serpentine line. Notice how it starts off with the yellow stripe and then slowly transforms into yellow leaves with a green stripe over here. And he can take these colors that are occurring in nature and make them feel supernatural. My 7-year-old son saw this central picture and he said, "Oh my God, the floor is lava." And I mean, this isn't an edited photograph. These are just leaves assembled around the roots of a sycamore tree. This is a great little line of leaves from an elm tree stretching across this river. And over here, it's like he's created a little sweater for these branches. Again, just using leaves and oftentimes his own saliva. He does work in snow and ice as well, sometimes deceptively easy. I always look at these things and I think, well, I want to try doing these things. I could make snowballs, but I probably couldn't make this beautiful necklace of snowballs between these two branches. And I certainly couldn't take icicles and reform them into spirals like he's done. It's very easy to find videos of him creating this work here, where he's just breaking up icicles and chewing them down and then reforming them to create this absolutely gorgeous form that seems to weave in and out and through this rock here. And it's all lit up in this photograph. Now in Scotland, where he lives, it gets cold, but it never stays too cold. So he has these like momentary, these very brief engagements with ice and snow, and he's able to make things like this serpentine sculpture made out of snow and this starburst made out of icicles. Doesn't this just knock your socks off? This was a construction from 2010. And once again, it was something he made. Nobody was walking out there to see it in person. It was something that existed in the natural world. We only can appreciate it because of the photograph. It collapsed 2 days after it was made. I can only imagine that sense of frustration. Andy Goldsworthy went to the top of the world to create this installation that we see over here called Touching North from 1989. He created these 4 portals using indigenous methods for cutting snow and ice. I can tell you right now, we won't get into the logistics, but building an arch is a really tough thing to do. And he's done it 4 times over at the very top of the planet. So whichever arch you go through, you're moving south. And sort of like Nancyholt and her sun tunnels, they kind of frame up a beautiful view over here. So we'll end with Andy Goldsworthy's work at Storm King, which is an outdoor sculpture park in New York State. And he did the Storm King stone wall that we see here, that is another beautiful serpentine line that's going in and out in between all of these trees on the property. Now, this was another major undertaking, and this was actually his first museum commission for permanent work in the United States. This is 1998. And there's a lot of really interesting interpretation around this. Some think that he was interested in the way Americans like to take sides on things. And so a stone wall seemed like a good symbol of that. It also reminds me of Robert Frost and mending fences. Good fences make good neighbors. But the experience of it is this really sort of almost comical twisting rock wall that flows in and out between these trees here, and then ultimately goes down into the water and then comes out on the other side of this body of water as a perfectly straight, normal stone wall here. So there's so much to love and appreciate in Andy Goldsworthy's work. We'll wrap up tonight just reflecting on how these different artists have contributed to this movement. We have Robert Smithson, our philosopher. He introduces the key concepts and makes them real on a grand scale, makes them valid. And then Nancyholt Holt. I just love her work. She brings the heavens down to earth. She creates things that are built to last, not meant to be degraded by the environment over time. And then she makes things that are people friendly, destinations and gathering places. Then we saw Anna Mendieta, who makes everything personal, right? It's work that excavates her emotional pain, her explorations of body, of gender. They're raw, powerful, and very vulnerable, and in so many ways seem to foretell that tragic death of hers. And then we have Goldsworthy. We can't get enough of Goldsworthy. He's the craftsman. He's the incredible artist who's building these ephemeral constructions and engagements with the landscape that Mother Nature could never produce on her own. He once said, "We often forget that we are nature. Nature is not something that's separate from us. So when we say that we have lost our connection to nature, we have lost our connection to ourselves." So if that doesn't motivate you to get out and start getting your hands in the dirt, I don't know what else will. I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments that you have. And thank you for your extra attention and time tonight. I'll start looking at the comments in the chat here.
Yeah, what a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much, Jane.
Thank you. Oh, Catherine, I see, has connected this to Frederick Law Olmsted, who's like our father of landscape architecture, and it's his 200th birthday. So this is just fortuitous. Thanks for mentioning that, Catherine. Let's see here. Oh, Frederick has come up with another association with Dark Star. Maybe it's a Grateful Dead connection there. That could also be valid. Incidentally, I'm still working my way through the questions here, but incidentally, if anybody is just like gaga over Andy Goldsworthy after having seen this, he's actually going to be in New Hampshire on May 12th. And there's a sculpture park called Alnoba in Kensington, New Hampshire. This is southern New Hampshire. It's probably not too far from where most of us live. And I think it's like $75 to go to a cocktail party with Andy Goldsworthy. I am going. If anybody wants
That's
to
so.
go.
I think that one of our attendees had shared that some of his art was there, but did not know. I don't think that they mentioned that he was actually going to be there. So that's really exciting. That's great. I will share that to everyone in an email tomorrow. De Cordoba was mentioned too. I have seen his pieces at the De Cordoba.
Thanks for mentioning that. Catherine seems to have a great background in this, so I'm glad for your contributions in the chat along the way, Catherine.
I do think it's really interesting to, I think it's interesting, but I do think it's kind of interesting to think about these. You made the connection to public art and sort of making the connection to artists like, well, Banksy is a little old now, but those people who use found art and just sort of like make it into art. And that's kind of what Andy Goldsworthy does, right? Like he just reforms what's already there,
right? Yeah.
Into a work.
Yeah, it's like he literally just stumbles across a certain landscape and he responds to what he sees. It's not like he's been collecting leaves for like a week in order to create something. He really is just engaging with what he comes across, which is all the more impressive, I think, when you look at his work.
Oh yeah.
Angela asked me, where in southern Ohio is that mound that I showed, the Serpentine Mound? Angela, I'm sorry, I don't have that in my notes, but absolutely, if you just Google Serpentine Mound, Ohio, it will come up. I apologize that I don't have that specific info. And I appreciate all the kind words that people are putting in the chat. And somebody has also added about Cristo and the gates in New York. This is why I have to do earth art too. I actually got an almost angry email from someone who said, how could you not include Maya Lin in the Earth Art program? But they ended up having a good time at the program anyway, so they forgave me for it. But there's a lot of great artists that just didn't make it in for tonight. And I appreciate you mentioning Christo, because his work and Jean-Claude's work certainly falls within this category. And it's so delightful. I just love it. But that will be for the next one, I guess. So forgive me for not having it. Yeah.
No, it was already a very full presentation. I do wonder about the assistants. Do most of these artists work with assistants?
Andy Goldsworthy with that stone ball that we looked at the end. Absolutely. I honestly, I don't think that he actually constructed any of it. I think he just
Directed
gave
it.
a direction. Yeah, exactly. That's a very good question. But I think most of the smaller works, all of that is 100% him. That's a really good question.
Yeah, I noticed Nancyholt with all of the trucks and everything that were bringing in those the tubes to the desert.
Right.
That's got to be a lot of orchestration as well.
Right.
A lot
You
of people
almost
involved
wonder
there.
like how much of the art form is like the administration of these things, like right.
Oh, the design is
overseeing it. Yeah.
absolutely, yeah. No, that's the most important part, right?
Yeah. I have a friend who makes these works made out of, toys from the 1950s. And I asked him once, I'm like, how much of your art form is just shopping for the toys? And he was like, oh God, you just saw right through everything I do.
It's curation. It's about
right,
curation.
Exactly.
It's having the eye. No, that's
Yeah.
great. No, it's so fascinating. That's why I love Andy Goldsworthy, because he just creates these amazing. There's a great
beautiful.
PBS documentary about him too. That is another thing that people might want to tune into. And there's I don't know if it's the same PBS, but there is a separate documentary, I think, about his work as well. But it's so fascinating. Anyway, I think that's all of our. Oh, okay. Someone just shared the address, I think, of the Serpent Mound. So that's great.
Thank you for doing
we
that.
also had some links, the De Cordova and the other museum that was mentioned. So definitely go and check that out. Again, Jane is going to be back online with us on the
last day of the month.
Last day of May. Yeah, May 31st. On Tuesday, May 31st, for library design, which is I'm definitely going to be there.
That's going to be fun.
Yeah. But thank you again, Jane, so much for your time tonight.
A pleasure.
It was really fun. And this is such a great, relevant topic. And I will be sending everyone a message tomorrow about this. Thank you so much.
Take good care. Bye.
Good night.